Hey, Doc, you remember which end of the rifle the bullet comes out of? Or does your training just cover bandages and fairy tales? The question, thick with condescension, echoed off the barren rock of the observation post. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the squad, the sound thin and sharp in the high-altitude air. The men, hunkered down behind sandbags and granite spurs, looked at Sergeant Croft, then at the target of his ridicule. Specialist Anya Sharma didn't flinch. She didn't look up. Her focus remained entirely on the contents of her aid bag, her hands moving with a practiced, almost hypnotic economy. She organized rolls of gauze, checked the seals on saline pouches, and ensured every tourniquet was perfectly staged for one-handed deployment. Her silence was a stark contrast to Croft's booming arrogance, a pocket of profound calm in a bubble of performative machismo. He saw a small woman, a medic, a support role he considered little more than a passenger in the real business of war. He saw her quietness as weakness, her methodical nature as timid uncertainty. But Captain Eva Rostova, observing from her position near the comms unit, saw something else. She saw a discipline so absolute it was unnerving. She saw hands that moved without a single wasted motion, a focus that seemed to filter out the entire world, including the sergeant's verbal barrage. It was the kind of focus she had only seen in two types of people, master surgeons and elite assassins. The sergeant mistook her silence for submission, but the captain felt a cold premonition, a sense that the scales of judgment were dangerously unbalanced. If you believe true competence is quieter than arrogance, you understand that some storms gather not with thunder, but with a deafening, deliberate calm. The true test was not in the insult, but in the silence that answered it, a silence that held more weight than any retort ever could. Sergeant Croft, emboldened by the lack of response, continued his monologue. He was a man carved from the old bedrock of the infantry, a believer in a simple, brutalist hierarchy where the loudest voice and the heaviest rifle held dominion. In his worldview, medics were a necessary afterthought, glorified mechanics for the human body who existed outside the sacred circle of trigger pullers. "Look at her," he sneered, gesturing with a thumb toward Sharma. "We're up here on the devil's doorstep, watching the most critical pass in this whole damned mountain range, and we've got one slot filled by someone who's probably never even zeroed a rifle properly. What happens when the shooting starts, huh, Doc? You gonna throw a roll of gauze at them? Sing them a lullaby?" He laughed, a harsh, grating sound. The other soldiers shifted uncomfortably. They respected Croft's experience, but his casual cruelty toward Sharma was a constant, grating presence on their long rotations. Yet, they said nothing. To challenge the sergeant was to invite his wrath, and it was easier to be a silent accomplice than a vocal target. Sharma, meanwhile, finished her inventory. She closed her bag with a soft click, the sound punctuating the end of Croft's tirade. She then took out a small whetstone and began to sharpen her trauma shears, the rhythmic, metallic whisper of steel on stone the only reply she offered. It was a sound of preparation, of professionalism. It was the sound of a tool being honed for its purpose, indifferent to the noise surrounding it. Captain Rostova watched, her jaw tightening. She knew Croft's attitude was a poison, an assumption-born cancer that degraded unit cohesion. She made a mental note to address it formally back at the FOB, but up here, in the thin, charged air of the observation post, she could only watch and wait, trusting the discipline she saw in her medic over the bravado she heard from her sergeant. The world shattered in a single, violent crack. It wasn't the familiar report of their own weapons. It was the deeper, heavier boom of a high-caliber anti-material rifle, a sound that carried with it a message of lethal precision. Corporal Diaz, the squad's designated marksman, was thrown back from his spotting scope as if struck by an invisible fist. He made no sound, slumping over the stock of his rifle, a crimson stain blossoming on the wall behind him. Before anyone could fully process the horror, a second shot slammed into the granite inches from Captain Rostova's head, spraying stone chips like shrapnel. She cried out, a sharp intake of breath, and collapsed against the sandbags, her hand instinctively going to her shoulder where a shard of rock had embedded itself. "Contact!" Croft roared, his parade ground arrogance vanishing in a flash, replaced by the raw, primal instinct of a cornered animal. "Sniper! Get down!" The squad scrambled for cover, their hearts pounding in their chests. The shots had come from the opposing ridgeline, a jagged spine of rock and shadow well over a mile away. It was an impossible distance, a shot that required masterful calculation of wind, elevation, and the planet's own rotation. They were pinned down by a ghost, a master of their craft who had turned their fortress into a cage. Croft peered through a small gap in the rocks, his face pale. "Can anyone see a muzzle flash?" "Anything," he yelled. The reply was a chorus of negatives. The enemy was invisible, patient, and had already proven their terrifying skill. Panic, cold and sharp, began to creep into the edges of the squad's discipline. Their own marksman was gone, and their enemy was a phantom with a thunderbolt for a rifle. In the midst of the rising chaos, a single point of calm remained. Specialist Sharma was already moving, not away from the danger, but towards it. She low-crawled across the exposed ground, her aid bag dragging behind her, her profile so low she seemed to merge with the rock. She moved with a liquid efficiency that defied the panic gripping the others. She reached Captain Rostova, her eyes already assessing the wound, her mind working through a triage checklist. Rostova, gritting her teeth against the pain, looked past the wound, past the fear, and saw the medic's face. There was no terror in Sharma's eyes. There was no adrenaline-fueled panic. There was only a profound, chilling focus, an absolute concentration that seemed to bend the surrounding chaos to its will. It was in that moment that Rostova understood. The sealed addendum in the file, the code name, the quiet discipline. It all coalesced into a single, desperate, and yet perfectly logical conclusion. "Sharma." The captain gasped, her voice a strained rasp. She pushed away the medic's hands. "Leave me." Sergeant Croft's M107. "Take it." Sergeant Croft, hunkered down nearby, overheard and stared as if the captain had lost her mind. "Captain, what are you saying? She's a medic. For God's sake, she's not qualified for that shot." But Rostova's eyes never left Sharma's. "Take the Barrett," she commanded, her voice gaining a sliver of its iron authority. "Take the shot." Sharma paused for a fraction of a second, her gaze meeting the captain's. It was a moment of pure, silent communication, an acknowledgement of a hidden truth finally brought into the light. Without a word, she gave a single, sharp nod. "Understood, ma'am." She turned and moved towards the massive rifle resting where Diaz had fallen, her movements no longer just efficient, but filled with a terrible, undeniable purpose. The squad watched, mesmerized, as the medic they had dismissed became something else entirely. Her hands, which they had only ever seen handle bandages, closed around the cold steel of the .50 caliber rifle with an unnerving, familiar grace. She settled behind the weapon, her body becoming one with the machine. She didn't use the rangefinder. She didn't consult a dope chart. She simply tilted her head, feeling the treacherous crosswind on her cheek, her eyes scanning the distant ridge not for a man, but for a disruption in the natural pattern of the world. The universe shrank to the crosshairs of the scope, the rhythm of her own breathing, and a single, invisible point over a mile away. She let out half a breath, her finger tightening on the trigger. The thunderous roar of the Barrett was the sound of a judgment being rendered, an assertion of competence so profound it shook the very mountains. And then, there was only the ringing in their ears and a silence more absolute than anything they had ever known. For a full 10 seconds, the world seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was the mournful whistle of the wind moving through the mountain pass, a sound that now seemed to carry a new, reverent weight. Sergeant Croft was frozen, his mouth slightly open, his mind struggling to reconcile the image of the quiet medic with the earth-shattering roar that had just erupted from the rifle she commanded. He had been prepared to scream at her, to tackle her away from the weapon, but the sheer, unhesitating certainty of her actions had paralyzed him. Now he could only stare. The squad's new spotter, a young private named Jennings, finally raised his binoculars, his hands trembling slightly. He scanned the distant ridgeline, his search frantic at first, then slowing as he focused on a small, unnatural shadow nestled between two rocks. He held his breath, waiting for movement, for any sign of life. There was none. I see him," Jennings stammered, his voice cracking with disbelief. "He's down. The shot. It went right through his scope." He lowered the binoculars, his face ashen with awe. "One shot. From this distance, with that wind." "Captain, that's not a possible shot. That's, that's a miracle." As the words settled over the stunned squad, Sharma was already back at Rostova's side. She had ejected the spent casing, made the weapons safe, and moved back to her primary duty without a single backward glance. Her hands were once again the medic's hands, deftly cutting away the captain's uniform to get to the wound, her touch gentle but firm. The transition was so seamless, so devoid of emotion or triumph, that it was more shocking than the shot itself. Rostova watched her medic work, then slowly turned her gaze to Croft. Her voice, though weakened by pain, was laced with steel. "Sergeant Croft," she said, her words cutting through the thin air with precision. "You were saying something about qualifications?" The question was not an inquiry. It was a verdict, and in the profound, echoing silence, Croft had no rebuttal. The sergeant could only shake his head, a slow, bewildered motion. The foundations of his world had been pulverized and swept away in the space of a single heartbeat. The neat, orderly boxes into which he sorted people, grunt, medic, officer, liability, had been obliterated. He looked at Sharma, truly looked at her for the first time, and saw not the quiet woman he had belittled, but an avatar of a discipline he couldn't comprehend. Her calm was not timidity, it was control. Her silence was not weakness, it was the coiled patience of a predator. He was a seasoned infantryman, a man who had built his entire identity on his martial prowess, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was not even in the same league as the woman now applying a pressure dressing a few feet away. Captain Rostova saw the shattered arrogance on Croft's face and knew the lesson had been delivered more effectively than any reprimand ever could. She drew a ragged breath and addressed the rest of her wide-eyed squad. When Specialist Sharma was assigned to this unit, she began, her voice gaining strength. Her file was 90% black ink. Redacted, classified above my pay grade. But it came with a sealed addendum. For my eyes only, she paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. There was no list of medals, no commendations. Just a single, cryptic code name, Project Nightingale, and one direct order. In an exigent tactical circumstance, at the commanding officer's sole discretion, all standard range and weapon qualification protocols are waived for this operative. I didn't understand it. I thought it was a clerical error. But I watched her. I saw the way she observes everything, the way her hands are never idle, the way she moves with zero wasted energy. That is a level of training you don't get in AIT. That is a craft honed in places we are not cleared to know exist. The squad stared at Sharma, who was now checking the captain's vitals, her expression as placid and unreadable as ever. The medic they had ignored, the woman they had allowed their sergeant to mock, was a ghost. A legend hidden in plain sight, a secret weapon wrapped in a sterile white gauze roll. The legend of Nightingale arrived at Forward Operating Base Kestrel on the rotors of the medevac helicopter. It spread like a contagion of awe, leaping from the flight crew who had heard the breathless radio calls to the ground crew who guided the bird down. It moved through the trauma bay where doctors worked on Captain Rostova's minor wound. Their conversation dominated not by the injury, but by the story of how it happened. By the time the rest of the squad returned from the mountain, their story had already become mythology. They didn't call it the impossible shot or the mile-long miracle. They gave it a name that was both poetic and terrifying, the Nightingale's Call. The Barrett M107A1 rifle she had used was immediately taken out of the arms room rotation. It was placed on display in the Tactical Operations Center, a monument to the moment. Mounted just above its powerful scope was the shattered optic of the enemy sniper, the metal mangled around a single, perfectly centered 50 caliber hole. It was a testament to a level of precision that bordered on the supernatural. Sergeant Croft underwent a profound transformation. The loud, swaggering NCO was gone, replaced by a man who was quiet, watchful, and deeply humbled. He spoke less and listened more. A week after the incident, he found Sharma as she was leaving the medical tent. He stood before her, not towering over her as he used to, but standing as an equal. He didn't offer a clumsy, verbose apology. He knew words were his weakness, the very tools of his ignorance. Instead, he held out a freshly cleaned and oiled magazine for her M17 sidearm. "Doc," he said, and the simple word, once a diminutive, was now filled with a reverence that was almost painful to witness. Your gear. Figured it could use a cleaning. Sharma looked at him, then at the magazine. She took it from his hand. Thank you, Sergeant, she said, her voice even and low. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and walked away. The exchange lasted less than 10 seconds, but in that quiet moment, a universe of understanding passed between them. The lesson had been learned. Respect had been earned. The story of Anya Sharma's impossible shot became more than just a thrilling war story. It evolved into a foundational piece of the unit's institutional culture. New soldiers, fresh-faced and filled with the arrogant certainty of the uninitiated, were sat down and told the tale. It wasn't presented as a celebration of a kill, but as a cautionary parable about the profound danger of making assumptions. It was a lesson in humility, a reminder that the measure of a warrior is not found in the volume of their voice or the insignia on their collar, but in the depth of their competence. The nameplate above Sharma's bunk, once a simple plastic strip reading SPC Sharma, was quietly replaced. Someone had taken a spent .50 caliber casing, polished it to a shine, and engraved a single word onto it: Nightingale. Sharma never mentioned the change, but she never took it down. Her life at the FOB continued as it always had. She treated blisters, stitched up gashes from careless mistakes with concertina wire, and handed out hydration packs before long patrols. She remained the quiet, unassuming medic. But the way the soldiers looked at her had fundamentally changed. They saw her now. They saw the calm in her hands not as simple gentleness, but as the manifestation of an iron will and absolute control. They interpreted her silence not as timidity, but as the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. In a single, thunderous moment on a remote mountaintop, she had irrevocably shattered their prejudices and redefined their understanding of strength. She had proven, beyond all doubt, that the most dangerous person on the battlefield is not always the one with the biggest weapon, but the quiet professional who, when the time comes, can perform their duty with an inhuman, perfect precision. Years later, the bitter conflict in those jagged, windswept mountains had receded, becoming a chapter in history books and a collection of faded photographs. The observation post where it all happened was abandoned, the sandbags slowly surrendering to the relentless wind. But the legacy of that day endured, carried forward in the memories and the teachings of those who were there. Captain Eva Rostova, now a major and an instructor at the academy, often stood before auditoriums of bright-eyed cadets and told the story of Nightingale. She didn't tell it to glorify war, but to teach a far more important lesson about leadership and human perception. She spoke of Sergeant Croft, who had retired as a command sergeant major, renowned throughout the service for his quiet wisdom, his profound humility, and his almost supernatural ability to identify and nurture elite talent where others saw only mediocrity. And she spoke of specialist Anya Sharma. After her tour, Sharma's name simply vanished from the rolls. Her records were sealed, her presence dissolving back into the deep, classified shadows of the special operations community. No one knew where she went. She left no trail, no forwarding address, only a legend. But Rostova taught her cadets that Sharma's true legacy wasn't the single, impossible shot. The legacy was the deafening silence that followed it. It was the look of shattered arrogance and dawning comprehension on a hardened sergeant's face. It was the quiet, unbreakable respect that bloomed in the place of loud, ignorant mockery. Her legacy was a simple, powerful, and enduring truth, that true strength has no need to boast. It has no need for validation. It simply waits, calm and prepared, for the moment it is needed, and then it performs its duty, flawlessly, silently, and without a single backward glance. That legacy is a powerful reminder that our assumptions are the cages we build for ourselves, and our prejudices are the bars that block our view of the truth. It stands as a testament to the fact that respect is not an entitlement of rank or role or reputation, but a currency that can only be earned through the execution of undeniable competence. The quietest person in the room is not to be overlooked. They are to be observed, for they are often the ones who have mastered their craft so completely that they no longer require the validation of words. Their worth is not measured in the stories they tell, but in the results they deliver when the stakes are highest. Their quiet professionalism becomes a story in itself, a silent lesson that echoes through briefing rooms, training fields, and the memories of those they served alongside. It teaches that the ultimate professional is not the individual who can talk the best game, but the one who, when the game is on the line, can fundamentally and irrevocably change the outcome. They understand that a true legacy is not a monument you erect for yourself in stone and bronze, but a foundation of principle and excellence you lay for others to build upon. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud ignorance, and where professional silence defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.